Hello, everybody. I've got some housekeeping first. Let me do the housekeeping first. So we're not expecting a fire alarm. If it sounds, go out the way you came in. The event's being recorded. The camera's going to focus on Neil and me, but it will capture sound. So if you are attending the event, you're consenting to be included in the recording. If you don't want to be recorded, I think you've got to go. We're going to have lots of time for Q&A from all of you, so get your brain cells working. And after this bit, there's going to be a book signing and a drinks reception in the reading room next door. So my name's Diane Coyle, and I am Bennett Professor of Public Policy and co-direct the Bennett Institute here at Cambridge. It's going to soon become the Bennett School of Public Policy. It's all very exciting. And I've been working with Neil on questions about research and policy around AI. Neil is the chair of AI at CAM, and he's the inaugural DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning here at the University of Cambridge. And he's been working on machine learning models for a very, very long time, including spending 3 years as Director of Machine Learning at Amazon. He's also a visiting professor at Sheffield and co-hosts the Talking Machines podcast, which is well worth a listen. So we are going to talk about this fantastic book, and I'm going to grill him gently about that, and then you get your own chance, and you get a chance to buy a signed copy afterwards if you want to. So Neil, well, I'm going to start with the audience. Who uses the new kinds of models, ChatGPT and so on, regularly? Show of hands. Oh, it's that kind of audience. Okay. And who would say they're optimistic about AI and what it's going to do for us? There's fewer people, but there are still some optimists out there. Let's see what happens at the end. So Neil, our fascination with AI comes because of the way that we think about how we relate to them. What are they going to do for humans? And a sense of implied threat, perhaps, that involves. So your book is exploring these kinds of fears and issues. So I'm going to lob a gentle question to start with, which is, can you tell us, give us a summary of the book, and also tell us why you thought you wanted to write it? Why now?
Yeah, I guess, and it's a great point to start with, that fascination with AI. I see two sides to that. One is that sometimes it can be quite narcissistic, but I think when well deployed, it can be quite introspective. And one way of summarizing the book is it's trying to push the more narcissistic thinking into the introspective space, trying to get us to think about where we'd like to be by having this place to stand, this other intelligence that allows us to look back at our intelligence and actually really admire it for what it is. So
explain more what you mean by narcissistic and introspective. That needs unpacking a bit.
So the title is about the atomic human, is trying to sort of answer this question, if I have a sort of piece of matter and I cut it in two, and then I take one of the halves and I cut it in two, and I keep doing that. Eventually, the Democritus suggested you get to a point where you can't cut. And the notion of the atomic human is, what's the equivalent of that when the machine is taking away things that we used to think as unique to us? So whether that's having a conversation or translating something or playing chess, it's like they're cutting into us, and what's left? And at the heart of that, for me, the answer is, well, if it's one of our capabilities, then the machine's probably likely to be able to emulate it. I think the interesting answer is, it's not our strengths and capabilities that are left, it's our vulnerabilities and limitations, and that's the answer I give in the book. But one of those limitations is the limited ability to communicate. In terms of me speaking now, my rate of communication is about 2,000 bits per minute, so 2,000 coin tosses a minute, whereas two machines can go at 600 billion coin tosses. So that's the difference between walking pace and the speed of light. Now, that's an enormous difference, and that's already here. You don't need AI for that. But what's remarkable about us is how we overcome that limitation, and one of the ways that we overcome that limitation is we're constantly thinking about each other, and whether we like it or not, and maybe not always thinking nice things about each other, but we're constantly mirroring what other people might want and imagining what they want. So when we're engaging with other intelligences, we're assuming they're sort of human-like and that we can accommodate them in that way. So I think it's very natural that when we're engaging with artificial intelligence, we project the same thing. We do it also with dogs, with animals, with pets. Sophie from Romania. We project onto them human feelings. And I think when that's unhealthy, that's narcissism. But when it's healthily used with the machine, it's introspection. And the shift that I sort of see, it's quite a long time ago, I had this realization that a lot of the debate we see around AI, this is about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the first wave of AI excitement, I sort of thought, well, the debate we're seeing is quite similar to the sort of discussions that Greek religion had around its mythology, in terms of the sort of things people talk about is, oh, well, if I had such power, I would do all these crazy things. I want to upload my brain. I want to become immortal. The sort of things that you see early civilizations, shortly after the formation of writing and the creation of large cities, moving away from animistic cultures into these cultures where the gods are running around behaving quite badly. And it's sort of interesting that the AI debate we're having now is very, very similar to that. And I thought, wonder why that is. And maybe thought, well, is it because once you have this notion of an external intelligence and you start to think about that culturally, you tend to project these bad human behaviors in the first case onto it. But I'm not religious myself, but then when I sort of thought, well, how do we fast forward that? Well, what does religion do? If you look at modern religion, the way it uses the notion of our intelligence versus a powerful intelligence is it does trigger introspection. It sort of says, well, okay, so there's this perfect being, however people want to describe it in whichever religion, and you are vulnerable and weak and not capable, but you can try and overcome that and be better than your underlyingness. And how can you think about that? How can you introspect? And a lot of that for me drives people towards community and to doing things that together are better than the sum of those individuals are. And I think one of the really interesting things about a lot of interesting culture, whether it's academia or literature, it also tries to do the same thing. So that's what I mean by that shift, is that there's this natural tendency to sort of see ourselves reflected in whatever intelligence we're looking at. And when you look at that, the way that panned out in religion, I think that there's, Greek myths kind of, it's a lot of fun to listen to Stephen Fry describing it or whatever else. But in some sense, it's not very pleasant religion in terms of the things these gods are doing. Whereas I think you do see in modern religions an ability for people to use that notion of an outside intelligence to try and improve themselves. And, maybe it's a foolish thing to think that you can do, but that's kind of what the book is trying to do, is push that debate away from that narcissism to that introspection, accelerate that process of saying, look, what's really extraordinary here is the human intelligence. And yes, the machines can do all this, but use that to reflect about what's precious about you and your fellow humans.
I like the parallel of AIs with gods and ghosts behaving badly or not. This point about decision-making is really interesting, because a lot of talk in my area of public services is that if you want to improve the efficiency of public services, then you're going to have to use AI, and that means getting the new versions to make some decisions. Mm. And you talked about us projecting onto the machines. I read an interesting paper recently that had the opposite finding. It was looking at radiology scans and looking at when there were better outcomes with joint human-machine decision-making. And if the machine had a high probability one way or the other, there wasn't a lesion or there was a lesion, then you got good decisions. But if the machine was uncertain, then the humans made bad decisions. Mm. And the authors argued it was because the machine is projecting its own way of thinking onto the human decision-maker, and we're just not that rational. So tell us what you think about this push towards having joint decisions and whether it's going to work well or end badly.
It's super complicated and I think the medical examples are always very interesting, because one thing we don't have is a very good understanding of how two regular expert humans are sharing their notions of uncertainty. And of course, the weird thing that we're doing is, as computer scientists, and particularly machine learning, those of us who are statistically trained, or in economics, people learn about uncertainty and how to describe it in error bars, p-values, whatever the right mechanism is. But regular folk don't have any intuition for that. And in fact, there's an enormous amount of abuse of those measures of uncertainty in the scientific literature, p-value hacking and these sort of things. But the weird thing is we sort of are starting to sort of suggest that that's the gold standard and that it would work well if the machine can just express that I'm only 60% confident. But actually, no one can really explain to me what it means to sort of say there's a 10% chance of rain today. You know, that's already a sort of like an odd statement. But I think there's a lot of evidence that two experts coming together, if they're convened well and they have respect for each other and they're patient and listening to each other, can gain a more developed understanding of a case through conversation. And I think what's super interesting is we don't really have any deep understanding of how that's happening. There's certainly good work in psychology around hesitation being associated with uncertainty. So if you ask someone to answer a question, then you can, if you measure the hesitation, then that can be a proxy for uncertainty. But that's very, very simple compared to what we might think in your radiology example, that if you had two radiologists looking at the case, how they would discuss it and how they're trained to discuss it. So I think that one of the really exciting things about this technology is actually it allows us to ask different questions and do new things with these types of experiments to get a deeper understanding of how we're sharing uncertainty. Because there's a sort of, it feels like in my field, everyone's like, oh, and now we need the computer to tell everyone with 74% this is the answer. When actually the ideal solution, and maybe we can't get there, and maybe there's problems with going this way, might be more what we would like the machine to do is interact with the human in such a way that the human gets a calibrated sense of the machine's uncertainties, rather than it's giving a number. Now, of course, if the human is trained to process that number, fine. But in many, many cases, humans aren't well trained to process such numbers. And such numbers are actually quite poorly defined, or they may be very specifically defined in a way that doesn't actually map on to the quantity of interest. Something like, well, the percentage of this is malignant or something like that. Well, but then on top of that, you need to take into account, the difference between a false positive and a true negative, these sort of things, which are all part of a decision-making process that a trained doctor will have a lot of intuition on, an experienced doctor will have a lot of intuition on, and it's not necessarily, if that intuition hasn't developed alongside machine inputs, that's, I think, going to trigger some problems. And maybe that wasn't quite the area that the paper's talking about, but I think it's super interesting. The whole interface between human and machine becomes very interesting.
So are you saying we ought to be thinking about our engagement with the AI as being like humans encountering Vulcans for the first time? And so you've got to learn how this somewhat alien intelligence operates before you can work well as a team?
Yeah, partially. I think it's a mix, though, because it's of course, what for those of you who do engage with it, you know it's incredibly powerful. And what it's doing is just emulating what humans. So it's like this group of Vulcans, they haven't got some more logical, rational way of thinking. All they've done is just observed humans, and they're just copying it. So in some sense, they're just giving you some version of what a human answer would be, while simultaneously having access to a lot more information in giving you that answer. So at that point, it sort of feels, well, we're done for then, because they're emulating us without and have greater access to information. But they don't have any social stake in the decision. So the key point is that we have, as individuals, have reputations. So if we give opinions about things, we're putting some sort of social stake into it. Whereas if there's a mistake in what the machine's doing, which there can be for any number of reasons that doesn't have the full context or whatever, then it's like, oh, well, who do you blame? Whose fault is it? And it can only be the fault in our society. We can only hold each other to account if there's a human involved in a consequential decision. Of that form. So I think that it isn't quite like that sort of Star Trek idea. It's sort of interesting, the Star Trek Vulcan, or later on they had that character Data, didn't they? Which was always like this sort of notion of like, there is a more rational way of being intelligent that these Vulcans and robots
quite like
have.
An economist, actually. That's the ideal economist.
Yeah.
So, but is that the right thing for the computer scientists to be doing? Should they be trying to make these models match humans and best humans? Because, of course, that's what people worry about in terms of jobs vanishing.
I think one of the problems we have is that the people who are creating these solutions at the moment and deploying them are arguably some of the least equipped people on the planet to design socially adjusted solutions, because I mean, they're very brilliant people, very intelligent people, but they almost explicitly have chosen sets of professions that isolate them from the type of human emotional contact that many, many roles in society, including public sector, require. The thing I think I'm really nervous about is that this has happened before, and the previous wave of people who imposed on society their vision of how we should reform society with their simple ideas of what society should look like were actually early statisticians, but they didn't call themselves statisticians, they were eugenicists, right? And they came from this university as graduates. They actually believed that the Cambridge University mathematical tripos was the ultimate rank of intelligence. And by the way, that was before the tripos was reformed. So the mathematical tripos at the time was basically solve Newton's laws in lots of different complicated ways, because that was the only maths that was taught. And that turned into a very difficult societal debate where they said, well, because I'm defining intelligence in this way, and under my definition of intelligence, everyone else is worse than me, we're doomed. And very simplistic and wrong argument that, and we in Britain are the founders of the eugenic movement. And I see a lot of parallels with the very sort of simplistic treatment of intelligence that we have from the people who are deploying artificial intelligence algorithms. Some of those, actually it's a minority of those that create them, because of course it's unfortunately those who say the most simplistic things that are most reported on. Most of my colleagues would have a much more nuanced opinion about these technologies, but of course the ones that are rushing to deploy them, or the ones that are most quoted in the media, are the ones that have the opinions that are most aligned with what I see as very eugenic opinions.
If you ask businesses what they're doing with generative AI, mainly they'll say, oh, we're using it in the marketing function. So they're picking up certain functions where they can easily see the way to cut costs and substitute labor. So there's that concern. What other concerns would you have about broader social impacts?
Well, just to pause on the marketing one for a moment, I think it's very amusing that people think they can fire their marketing department, because the purpose of marketing is to flex that you have the wealth to market, right? Top-level marketing, if you go to Chanel or whatever else, the amount they're spending on marketing, it's part of their brand prestige. Like my favorite example demonstrating the problem with people's understanding of marketing at the moment is the Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow, right? So
who's been to the Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow?
It was famous in the news because it was a Willy Wonka experience that was advertised, I think, around Christmas or something, that had this amazing marketing material, all produced by generative AI, by some generative AI whiz kid, that a load of families went to, and when they got there, it was just sort of like a trestle table with some sweets and someone dressed up or something. Because he'd also tried to do the experience, the physical experience itself with generative AI. He'd scripted things, and the AI had created a new version of Willy Wonka with a weird character in it, so he put that in. And it was just a terrible experience. And what was interesting about that is that you realize, well, what marketing is if you have the ability to spend £20,000 on marketing, then probably you might have spent at least £30,000 on the experience. So marketing is some kind of display, like a peacock tail. I can sustain this tail, right? And what's going on where people are sort of saying, great, I can cancel my marketing department? Well, they're losing their ability to differentiate themselves from kids who are working with generative AI. So this is one of these enormous misunderstandings around the technology, that somehow that replaces human effort. No, it replaces our ability to recognize human effort. And businesses will have to come out with new ways of putting in human effort, because the real cost will always be human attention, right? So what we end up doing is moving to an economy where human attention is the key thing. And businesses that don't differentiate by being able to display that they've applied human attention are just really vulnerable to being taken over by another business that is just scaling better than them. Unfortunately, though, this disruption to our ability to recognize human attention, which is a sort of such an odd thing, isn't it? And of course, we see it with the copyright arguments at the moment as well, that the machine has just copied us and can reconstruct what used to take a large amount of time. That's like beneficial for about 5 years. And then after that, we just have to find new ways of differentiating. And I think that this is coming back to the jobs thing, which I think is sort of the basis of the question. This is the real problem we face, is it's not so much that there won't be human jobs, it's just that the nature of those jobs is being massively disrupted at the moment, particularly, and most clearly in the creative industries. And when it comes to the understanding of some of our policymakers in terms of how to react to that and how to adapt to that, it just seems to be absent. There just seems to be this massive naivety, like, oh, that's great. Well, we won't have to have people creating television shows in the future because the computer will just create them for us. Well, no, there's going to have to be some way of differentiating based on human input. And the fact that we no longer know quite what that looks like is just disruptive for everyone and very difficult and uncertain, I think, particularly for young people trying to understand what to do.
So you don't think the AIs can be creative themselves?
I think it becomes, with Jess 10 years ago, we did work for the Royal Society that was where we asked various things about how AIs could do things in health, education, medical, well, just everything, security, marketing, finance, and for every single category, people could see, these are regular members of the public, convened in sort of meetings around the country, public dialogues, people could see the advantages and how AI could make their lives better. The only one area where they said that's a ridiculous and stupid idea, why would you ever do that, was AI-generated art. Because the answer from the public is, well, by definition, creativity is human. And what would be the point in having a machine doing that? Now, that was their answer, and I don't pretend to be making definitions around creativity, but I have a lot of sympathy for that answer. And if we want to move away from that answer, if you want to move into a zone where you're allowing the machine to be creative, then just bear in mind that the machine's going to operate millions of times quicker. So, it's sort of like what you end up with is a natural equivalent of the arts and craft movement. Queen's College Chapel, built during the arts and crafts movement, 1890s. People hand-carved everything as a sort of pushback against machine carving. As soon as something becomes mass-produced, it loses value in some way. And it's really that value that we're sensitive to in society, that there was human attention applied. Now, of course, there's lots of things that become mass-produced and become cheaper and become accessible through the economies of scale and so on and so forth. But there's still, the way to differentiate is, while some human was involved, there was some special touch, it was handmade. I remember discovering in my grandma's house, some box of something where inside you open it up and it said machine made, because for a brief moment of time that was a thing, yeah. Because it was more accurate. It was, there were finer tolerances around a machine-made article, but it's only the briefest moment of time before people are like, well, actually, I'd rather have something that someone put some thought into. So whatever people's definition of creativity, where people see value is where they see sort of the fingerprints of human attention. And if we've lost the ability to differentiate, and that becomes quite problematic between the fingerprints of human attention and something that a machine has done, then I think that we're really in a lot of trouble.
I was mentioning beforehand, I had a conversation with a lawyer this afternoon who said that one of his litigation colleagues was involved in a case where the defense and the prosecution were arguing about which AI model they were allowed to use for discovery before the trial. So there are going to be all kinds of strange issues that we need to deal with. Where would you see the big problems emerging? What sort of domains? Is it health? Is it defense? Is it law? And say more about the policy, which is my kind of territory. What do you think policymakers need to respond to?
So I've just, in fact, I think it's just been accepted by the Charity Commission. I've accepted to be a trustee for a new charity, AI in Education, because I think everything, that you said, we'll come back to that, but I think I'm so worried about with just education overall, and the need. My argument sort of goes something like this: is when you look at what these models are capable of doing, one way of looking at them is that they're a bit like a GPS for intellectual navigation. And why is that an interesting way of looking at them? Because it turns out that at the human brain, we use our hippocampus. It fires in sympathy with our prefrontal cortex. When we're thinking our way through a problem, the bit of brain that is so enlarged in us is actually operating very closely with the hippocampus, which is a much older bit of brain than is there in lizards and is associated very closely with navigation. So it's where, if you ever hear about place cells or these experiments with rats in mazes, they're always looking at the hippocampus. So it sort of also feels like it makes some intuitive sense, evolutionary, that we leveraged our navigational capabilities to think through intellectual problems. So I think I'm deeply worried that we get some sort of this cognitive atrophy, an undermining of critical thinking, whatever you want to call it. I mean, for my mind, it's the equivalent of, and you can just search this up on any internet, you can find lots of people who drive into harbors because their GPS tells them to, right? And what we're really looking at, and I think it's less of a worry like immediately because we've all had to come through critical thinking, we've had to do all these things ourselves. But, the possibility that in 30 years' time, you've got people in these positions who are supposed to be passing these judgments, who have spent their entire time being guided by a sort of reasonable first-pass approximation to the machine, is totally horrifying. And that's the sort of thing that gets missed in the rush to, I managed to fire the marketing department, or, I saved 30%, in the Department for Work and Pensions by doing whatever I did. Because we're talking about not developing a generation of young people to fulfill their role in society. And so many of the tasks that we're talking about automating are the tasks that you would normally expect a junior to do. Could you do the discovery? We need a team of people doing the discovery. Go out there doing the reading. We've got a team of young lawyers that we're going to bill for a senior lawyer because we're a law firm and we're like that. But rather than going to an LLM, young lawyers have to sit there and understand what is important, what isn't, and that's how they learn. And it sort of always struck me cycling around Cambridge in the pandemic. I was just following my group, and then so I didn't know my way. So when I wanted to go to Clare on my own, I didn't know the way. And so since then, I've just tried to cycle without the GPS. And it's amazing, if you make a mistake at one junction, you never make that mistake again because you made the wrong turn. And there's something very similar in this space. So that's the big one. When it comes to the sort of the wider policy, I think we're in a very, very dangerous situation. As I know, you're more active, I'm very pleased to say, and more authoritative on this, on the monopolization of this technology by a few very large companies, which is really the other way in which we're being undermined as a human species. That the thing I keep saying is what we're being provided is like a one-size-fits-all solution. Imagine if, for clothes, we all had to wear the same sweatshirt. We don't wear anything underneath it. It just goes long enough. And then we just walk around wearing that. Because there's one company, and they found it most convenient just to create the same sweatshirt for everyone, because that's how they make their margins. Well, that's how software is made, right? Maybe there's some ability to tie it up together and bespoke it a little bit. But we are in a one-size-fits-all computer market. You all get the same pieces of software. You're all told, we'll solve it with Excel. And now they're trying the same thing with these large language models. And I think this is incredibly dangerous because what we really want is a market where it's being driven by software solutions that are supporting teachers in fulfilling what their role is. And teachers are the ones that know their own role best. It's not right that people are deciding how teachers should behave with software. you know, on the West Coast in California, and then that's being deployed across the world. That's really undermining the diversity of approaches that we might take even within the UK, but across different countries. And this is the other sort of really enormous policy area where I think we're taking multiple steps backwards over the last year in terms of ensuring that there's a good market, that new young people can build companies or older people can build companies and start to be active in providing solutions in this space. I'm really worried that we're making decisions that won't allow for that. But I mean, you should probably comment on that more because it's more your area of expertise.
Well, we might come back to that. I've got one more question for you, but I'm going to warn people in the audience that it's going to be your turn very soon. And it's back to this education point, Neil, which obviously anybody involved in teaching students worries about as well, because they do seem to believe often everything that the chatbot spits out at them. So what's your thinking about how to address that, how to fix it?
Well, I mean, first of all, there needs to be a shift in the conversation and a building in confidence of the teaching profession. And the example I keep giving teachers when I speak to them is because they sort of feel, well, you know, are we actually going to be useful? But is the example, I don't know if people have seen it, but Ian Wright, the footballer, meeting Mr. Pigden, his old teacher. Hands up if you've seen that example. Yeah, a few of you. It's just well worth searching it up, seeing it on YouTube. Ian Wright, you know, I think the details of his family background, he had an abusive father figure, I think wasn't his father. You know, he talks about what it meant to him to be on Match of the Day because, like, he wasn't allowed to watch it and crying in the corner. And then he talks about this one teacher that believed in him, Mr. Pigden, who happened to be an ex-Spitfire pilot, and it was his PE teacher. And it's not just because he was just an amazing... He was a good footballer. Obviously, presumably Mr. Pigden was interested in that. But I think he didn't develop as a footballer until quite late. He actually went out to work and was holding down a job as an apprentice, whatever, hod carrier or something, before he went into football. But what it meant to Ian that another human being believed in him, I think was far more than anything he was learning at school. And that relationship just seems to me to be the thing that is hardest to quantify and value. And if you go, so Baroness Honora O'Neill, another Cambridge figure, talks a lot about the substitution in her Reith lectures from 2002, which I think are still some of the most important lectures on AI, even though they're not on AI. They're lectures on process and the incorrect substitution of intelligent accountability and human judgment with process. So, we're just going to hold everyone to account through process. Well, the process is somehow dehumanizing, and it's removing these pieces because you can't measure. You know, Mr. Pigden was never given a sort of performance appraisal. Well, wasn't that brilliant? You've turned the child's life around today, because, you know, he probably didn't even know until he saw the story. But that is the human-to-human role, and it's a major piece of education. And how we maintain that while teaching critical thinking and develop children to understand our wider culture and what humans are about it just seems to be, and then through to university, and then also supporting people in society with that, you know, it goes across all levels. Just seems to be an extraordinarily important challenge, and one that is, we're all, those of us who are involved in it, we're not like covered in thousands of pounds to deal with it either. But it's just critical to the future of our children and their children. Yeah.
Are there teachers in the audience? Anybody here a teacher? I don't mean to pick on you, but do you want to reflect on this bit of the conversation?
Me?
Yeah, I am. Microphone there.
I think about it quite a lot, but I don't use it at present. I'm a physics teacher, and I put ChatGPT to the test a few times and found it somewhat wanting. I have found it useful to show my students ChatGPT's answers to certain things, and what is particularly interesting and useful is that they see exactly the same misunderstandings that are very common, but of course the web is full of misunderstandings, and that's what ChatGPT's been trained on, hasn't it? All the material out there full of misunderstandings, and I suppose it shows that the misunderstandings are perhaps more common than the understandings in the material on the web. So it's been useful in that point of view, but in general I don't feel it's as much of a threat as I can imagine some others.
essay writing and so on.
Precisely.
Anybody else on teaching before we open up for other questions?
You want to do?
Oh, yep. Could you just wait for the mic? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know what to say really, except for I think that the human touch in teaching is very important, and nothing can ever replace it. So it's a little joke, you know, it's looking into somebody's eyes, the students between themselves, and I don't think, myself personally, I don't see much space for AI in teaching, except for time when I'm preparing the lessons, maybe.
Thank you. Okay, other questions? Or I'm going to have to pick on somebody again at random.
Thank you for a very nice conversation. What do you think about, I mean, do you think that our society is developed enough from the social point of view in terms of its political class, its academic class, to be able to sort of regulate this in a way that it gives benefits for everyone instead of just concentrating it in a few hands only?
Yeah. I think trying to stand off that a bit, I think there's a lack of Socratic awareness of the challenges of doing that, even in the sort of like, I don't think any society can know what the right answers are in this or sort of say that they're set up for it. But the lack of awareness of that lack of being set up for it is really disturbing. And I think it indicates a deeper problem, which is quite widespread. I think particularly you see this in the United States at the moment, a failure to understand the complexity and sophistication of democratic institutionalism and how these different pieces of democratic society work. Or, I mean, of course, they appear often not to be working, but there's a lot going on behind in the background that is keeping things running. And I think the challenge is with a lot of these institutions, if you look at any of them, and we can pick any institution and we can sort of look at ways in which it's not doing as good a job as it could be, like the law, or, I mean, it's interesting, Honor O'Neill criticizes heavily journalism in her Reith lectures. It's the one lecture I don't like that much, because the journalism she's talking about is like a paradise in 2002 compared to what we have as journalism today. So it's very easy to find flaws and faults in the way we're doing things. Of course, we should constantly be striving to improve things. But what I'm really disturbed about is the failure from supposedly sophisticated people to understand that what's going on in these mechanisms, whether that's judiciary, whether that's the press, whether that's like the BBC or whatever else, is a key part of democratic institutionalism, even if we aren't directly voting for those things. And if you lose those things, you go very quickly to a sort of populism and dictatorship. And, you know, I think that the philosophical foundation for this, you could just look at Karl Popper, right? People who are writing during periods of, you know, fascism and communism, which are both populist movements of some form. And we see their rise coming forward again. And in many cases, it's being proposed and pushed forward on a basis that, oh, well, it's because this bit in society isn't working. Yeah, of course it isn't working as well as we'd like it to be, but we need to be improving that iteratively rather than trying to replace it wholesale. Now, sometimes we do want to introduce new technologies and replace them, but the lack of the awareness that there's a decision or that these things have a function and what that function is I think, deeply disturbing. And we certainly see that in the US majorly at the moment, but we see a lot of echoes of that in the rhetoric within the UK. And I think it's very sad because we are one of the few countries that I think is really equipped to handle this transition very well in terms of our capabilities, in terms of our quality of our civil service, in terms of the quality of our universities, in terms of the education of our wider population. And I think there's an obligation on us to do that well and show the way forward so that other people can learn from us. And at the moment, I don't see us taking that leadership role.
Rallying cry there. Other questions? One right at the back.
Hello. I'm a teacher, And that's just giving some context. I have a son who will never become a programmer, a computer scientist. He's doing lots of online AI, free courses, etc., spending a lot of time looking at the AI area because they see it as maybe a safe area to focus on for a job of the future. There's so much resource out there. Where would you advise a young person who doesn't have that kind of computer science interest but wants to be involved within AI? Where would you advise and guide them?
What else does he enjoy doing?
Lying on beaches and enjoying life.
Xbox and
reading books.
Does anyone remember Gary Larson, the cartoonist? Does anyone remember this? There was a panel cartoon he did called Hopeful Parents, which was, it was a kid sat in front of, I think it was Nintendo, and playing away, and the parents stood behind imagining a future. They were imagining newspapers, and it's like they're imagining 2006 or something, which was 20 years ago, but 20 years after the cartoon was written, where the newspaper ads were wanted Nintendo experts, $86,000 plus car, all these imaginary job adverts. And I remember seeing that advert at the time and thinking, what a ridiculous future. There's just no way in hell that anyone's ever going to pay anyone for playing video games. And of course, you can earn a fortune playing video games today. Now, not that I'm saying that your son should spend, but one of the things I think it shows is that across the period of his career, or any child's career at the moment, the changes are going to be well beyond our imagination. But they were also well beyond our imagination across our careers. And the way that we support people around that is we encourage them to do things that will allow them to preserve their choices, to follow things that make them passionate, but to sustain their curiosity and to continue to do things that maintain their diversity of choice. Now, not everyone is in that position. I remember I always like to talk to taxi drivers because people end up driving taxis for different reasons. And one I was speaking to was in a band, and all his mates went to university, so he lost that. So he decided to go to catering college, and he ended up doing catering in Lancaster Prison, the castle, in the middle of Lancaster. And then he told me very specifically, Kenneth Clark closed that down, and that's how he ended up driving a taxi. And I think one of the things we have to worry about from a society perspective is the need to be jobs and then so I ended up driving a taxi, because it's fine. He was enjoying it. He was driving the students around, and he was very happy with what he was doing. But it has to be the case. Say again?
Now we're going to have self-driving cars.
Well, it's one of the interesting things, isn't it? Because when you actually talk to a taxi driver about what their job involves, part of it, and I watch it in Cambridge, involves helping an elderly person out of the car into the shop. Or some taxi drivers are actually picking up kids, taking them to school, whose parent can't accompany the child to school. So there are a number of different interesting aspects to this role that we're not actually paying for. Or the fact that the person's pleasant. And that's what's very interesting, is how that comes into society. You want to say something, Diane?
Well, I was going to say people always forget that most jobs in the economy are, quotes, low productivity jobs, because we don't measure all of the things that they're doing, and they are important things, and they're important kinds of jobs to have.
Caregiving. I mean, and one of the problems is that the advice, if your son wants to be wealthy, advising them to enter these professions, which are clearly going to be around in some form for the next 40 plus years, is not the route to an enormous amount of wealth. And I think this is more Diane's area than mine. It is a real inequity in terms of where the money is going. But I would encourage, it's great that your son's interested in these things, and I think that the worry we have is that they're hearing too much, that it's all going to be AI, there won't be anything for them. And that's combined with, I think, a situation where the opportunities for young people are less than they were for me when I was at a similar age, which I find very worrying.
Because the way we want to get to with AI is that it's like electricity. It helps everybody do what they want to do better. It becomes very cheap. It becomes a commodity. So the challenge I see is how to get from there's very few large companies that are taking all the value for themselves from the technology to that it's a really useful tool that enhances everybody's ability to do what they want to do.
And we know when we're there when people aren't talking about it, right? Because no one sort of says, oh, well, I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to light the room, so I'm going to use electricity, you know, because it just works, right? Of course, and there is, of course, safety issues around electricity that we have to worry about, the standards around how we do that. But you can tell when something's working when people stop talking about it. When you get to the point when you call a computer a telephone, even though it's not a great telephone, you can tell the computer is to some extent working.
The Victorians were very afraid of electricity. There are Victorian cartoons of people walking down the street suddenly being electrocuted by a lamppost. So they worried about the safety of that as well. So there's a question here near the front. I'm making you run around, sorry.
Thank you. Just about 15 minutes before leaving for this very interesting talk, I came across a real-life AI issue, which is very basic, but actually I think gets to the heart of many of the problems of public perception of AI and public cynicism and distrust. And the word is trust, because I just looked up something about what solicitors are actually, what they can and cannot do in terms of asking for one's money before buying a house and when they can ask for it. And I Googled forever and I found no definitive answer. But of course, at the top of the Google chain is the AI answer. And it gave me exactly what I wanted to know. But I had no way of checking the sources or indeed whether, I actually was being fed, a lie, basically, or to something, a euphemism. But you see, this, I think, is this is really where the problem is really, the nub of it exists, and that is trust. And how do you get around that?
I think it's a great question, but I also think it's kind of a problem every time what I think of as the information topography changes. Because in some sense, these trust things only exist over time when there's, an institution or a person who we've come to believe can stand for that. So like, being a solicitor oneself, there's a sort of old institutional structure around that. And we're trusting the profession and the aspects of the profession around the solicitor as much as we're trusting that individual. But if you go back to sort of Mesopotamia in 1700 BC, shortly after the Code of Hammurabi's come out, well, how did they know who to trust in terms of what the Shakanaku was going to say when they passed the judgment? Shakanaku was the king's representative in the town. And of course, it takes time. And that's one of the very difficult things with these technologies, is that these institutions have to have existed some time to have proven their usefulness. Actually, and I think so another very interesting group of work in this is Eleanor Ostrom's work on institutions and creating new institutions. We could have asked the same question of Wikipedia back in the day. Remember when Wikipedia came out, everyone was fussing, it's not like the Encyclopedia Britannica. But actually, nowadays, I think we would all agree it's generally better than the Encyclopedia Britannica, and certainly the studies that are showing that. But it takes time and understanding and emergence, and it's a sort of whole socio-technical thing going on. And exactly as you're sort of highlighting, I think the real challenge is at these moments of disruption when these new tools are emerging, it's like the ground has been pulled out from the feet because existing institutions are often undermined and in various ways by the technology, and yet they're not replaced by some sort of reliable source. And I do think the biggest area where we see that is journalism, right? Where journalists, I think real journalists are having a horrific time because they're trying to hold themselves to a professional standard. They're not very well paid. There's not an enormous number of jobs out there for them. And they're competing with people who are just dumping stuff on Twitter or Blue Sky and claiming to be experts.
Next question. One there, yes, and then after that, gentleman at the front. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. So, Ada Lovelace Institute recently published that around 72% of the UK public says laws and regulations would increase their comfort with AI, which has shot up from 62% 2 years ago. And there seems to be a historical social conditioning that when laws are in place, everything will go swimmingly. But we can agree to an extent that that's a very idealistic view. And also, hurriedly passing a law won't address the various issues we are discussing at the moment. So how can society be helped to be more critical of AI and consequently the laws that will be passed around it?
I think it's a great question. I think one of the, I mean, maybe you could never expect a top quality debate around this, but part of the challenge, I think, is around the quality of the public debate. And then I think another part of the big challenge is that, actually I said this in an interview in a Portuguese newspaper, and I translated it back to myself, and I'd said that regulation has become a dirty word. And it said, the translation I got back when I retranslated it into English was, regulation is a swear word. And I think that's almost like... And that's, and actually Diane and I have talked about that. It's a really problematic world when regulation seems to automatically imply we're going to pass a law, when actually regulation is things much more sophisticated, as you know, Kwejo, than that. And we're in such a privileged position with the very, very high quality of our regulators. But because there's become this sort of notion that regulation is anti-growth, we see, for example, current government explicitly doing down their own regulators, despite the fact Competition and Markets Authority, certainly in my experience, is one of the most sophisticated, advanced, forward-thinking regulators on this technology. Our government has chosen to constantly diss them, I mean, in effect, which is extremely disturbing because it undermines the quality of debate I think you're suggesting we need, Kwejo, in terms of it's not just about passing laws, it's about building an ecosystem of understanding that is responsive to what's going on the ground in terms of what a nurse or a teacher's experience of the technology is, how large companies are trying to protect their monopolistic positions, and what sensible and rapid interventions are that will enable new and innovative businesses to deliver the solutions we need. Now, the amazing thing is, I mean, I think it's my favourite act. I don't know if it's one of Diane's favourite acts, but 24th of May, 2024, Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act was passed just before the election. It nearly failed to get through. There was not a squeak about it in the newspapers, how close we came to failing to pass one of the most important pieces of legislation in this space for the last decade. It empowers our Competition and Market Authority with extraordinary powers to, with the appropriate amount of work, 9 months to evaluate whether a player has strategic market status, to find, I think, is up to 10% of global revenue, turnover. Up 10% of global turnover if these companies are transgressing. And instead of sort of saying, oh, wow, we really need to back them in, this, not just obviously the CMA is in quite a good position in terms of its expertise, but across our regulators, support them in terms of giving them money to understand how to train their staff and to be in a better position to be in contact with the public. What we have is, let's create an AI security institute for 100 million, where a bunch of effective altruists just sit there and talk about what killer robots look like. I mean, it's really deeply problematic because we are in a good position, I think, Kwejo, in terms of the laws we pass. It's not that it's perfect, but actually, and I think it's going back to Theresa May, that
Philip Hammond was the Chancellor who commissioned the Furman Review, which paved the way for the legislation.
And you see what's so interesting about that, despite perhaps this period of more chaos in political lives than certainly has been in my lifetime. I mean, well, actually, I was alive for the 3-day weeks, but I wasn't 4, so I don't remember it. Our system was functioning. Like, people were doing work that was well-founded, that has got good legislation in place, that is ready to go. But unfortunately, in the excitement, we're seeing a suppression of the sensible ideas that have come through the technocracy in the name of sort of misguided ideas about what's going to bring about growth.
So I think there are 3 kinds of regulation and people don't understand the difference. The analogy I use is the first kind is a branch falls down into the road, it's an obstacle, you want to clear it away. That's the kind of regulation that politicians are often thinking about. But there are 2 other kinds. One is the kind where there's a real trade-off. And speed limits are one of those. It's either you go as fast as you like or you kill people. And then the third kind is like traffic lights, where there are regulations and norms in force that enable things to operate much more smoothly. Yeah. And we need more of those kinds and fewer of the first kind. But the debate is so unnuanced, the public debate.
Yeah, I was trying to think of I love the traffic light. I was trying to think about like just the market in Cambridge Market. Like, there's regulations around what those stall owners can do. It's not a free-for-all, right? Now, I'm sure that they're not totally happy about what all the regulations are, but you can't just have it that anyone can ship up in the market and sell, or that, or you could, but it wouldn't be a very good quality service. The sort of regulation allows good competition in the right way, and that's the sort of piece. That's where it's become a swear word. Yeah.
There was a question right at the front here, and right at the front, and then I'll come back to you. I'm trying to make the mic holder run around as much as possible.
Hi. I'm curious about the value of the thing. You spoke earlier about these big tech companies, the tech bros, who are monopolizing the space. But in a way, our system is almost set up to exacerbate that. If you look at the money that's awash, being thrown at all sorts of ideas without any real sense of what the value of the thing is. So how do we build a system where we're able to really critically analyze and support these diversity of ideas and small firms and growing when we don't have the infrastructure for that? All the money is just flooding into firms that already have a valid idea, that can prove that they can be the so-called next unicorn. Nothing's going into that diversity of ideas to allow it to grow and then to build not just the tech capital, but also build the human capital alongside that to sustain these businesses. And I'm thinking here particularly in the context of this wonderful thing called the Oxford-Cambridge corridor thing. How does that compete with California?
That's a big question.
Well, I mean, Diane's much more expert on how we're quantifying the value. Part of my thinking is, yes, we definitely want to quantify things, but one of the challenges, if you quantify too much, you lose all the aspects of things that are difficult to. So the thing I always think is there's two types of questions. There's qualitative questions and there's quantitative questions, right? Almost every question we care about is a qualitative question, but the only questions we can answer definitively are quantitative questions. So you see this constant substitution of a quantitative question for a qualitative one. And that's okay, unless you've done it for too long, in which, unfortunately, the quantitative idea replaces the qualitative idea. Now, Diane's much more expert on how that's manifesting in data and what our mechanisms are for managing it. I'll just sort of let Diane sort of mention what thinking is in that around data and AI.
Well, people don't think enough about what data is being fed into the machines or being used to guide policy decisions. So I'm quite a fan of quantifying some things for which we're using a zero in calculations at the moment. Natural capital would be a good example of that. Lots of things that nature gives us we think are free and we overuse them. But there are other areas where it's going to be inherently difficult or we just are not quantifying. People worry a lot about surveillance. One might worry also about people who are invisible because their needs and their characteristics are not reflected at all in the data that's being fed into the machines. So it is a big question. It's a really interesting area, and I don't think, because we're both waffling a bit on that, I don't think we've got a good answer for you.
No.
Yes, but right behind you there. Thank you.
Come out a bit so I can see Neil. This question goes to both of you. Do you have any tips on how an enterprise could adopt AI more responsibly?
Maybe I'll start. One of the things, the main tip, and actually Diane and I were just talking about this beforehand, that I keep saying to businesses I think it's an error to think of how does AI transform my business. I think that the right thing to do is to stay in touch with what your business is. I meet a lot of people, big companies and small companies, saying, how can I use AI to transform my business? And it's like, well, I don't know what the future is going to look like. There's a number of things we can talk about that are interesting and people have tried. But to my mind, the businesses that will succeed are the ones that are most in contact with their customers. And I think the real challenge we face, and arguably actually with universities and teaching and across the board, is that when society's stable over time, we just devolve into separation of responsibilities and stop thinking about what our real role is. So instead of thinking about what does it mean to educate a child coming to Cambridge or a young person coming to Cambridge, we just go, no, it's this process of things where we sort of set exams. And what AI does is it disrupts that so totally and utterly that unless you are in contact with why you were doing these things, I think you're very vulnerable. Now, we're very privileged in Cambridge because we have this prestige protection. But for many of our colleagues in universities that don't have this prestige protection, this is a very, very live issue because they don't have other ways of differentiating. So my sort of main thing is that, like, if you think you can go into your business and just automate all the people out of the business, then you are also exposing yourself to a global competition where someone else can also automate everyone out of your business. So unless you've understood what your differentiating factor is and how that's specific to you, and the thing I keep saying to businesses, very often a large part of that differentiating factor will be people and culture of those people, then I think that the businesses are going to be in trouble. And you know, there's some really great examples of businesses destroying themselves at the inception of the internet. I mean, Marconi did that, didn't they? They went bankrupt very quickly because they tried to move very quickly to become an internet company. But they lost touch and understanding with what their business was.
I research productivity a lot, and I once asked an investor in financial companies how he thought about the productivity of the companies he was thinking of acquiring or investing in. And he said, it's how much money can they make off their customers? And so the answer, I would say, is be a responsible business. And if you're a responsible business, thinking about your customers, but also your employees and the environment in which you operate, then you'll be more responsible in deploying AI. Time for one last question, and you've got your hand up here at the front. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I want to tell you two very short examples of my everyday life. Not the future, but everyday life. We're using AI in my company, and my colleagues are on a regular basis answering emails using AI. But perhaps the sender of the email also used AI to create it. And the second example, my wife is doing studies. And I think it's not a secret that I think at the moment every student is at least trying to get their their essays better using AI. Not 100%, but at least getting it better with it. Correction and something like that. Another friend of mine is a professor, and he is using AI to get summaries out of long essays. So for me, it's absurd because we're shifting to a situation where machines are talking with machines.
Yeah. So I think it's very interesting, and to take the email example first. The way I always try and answer that one is it's because people are writing stupidly long emails that should be shorter. I mean, like particularly in academia, for example, I was making this point in our steering committee meeting today with a head of department present, and I was saying, look, in business, before you write to your boss, you think about what part of the problem you should be surfacing to your boss, if you're well trained, right? So if I'm writing an email to Jeff Bezos when I'm at Amazon, I'm damn well thinking about which bits he needs to know and what pieces he doesn't need to know. And I'm sitting there imagining his role and imagining how things look from his perspective and modifying my email accordingly. Actually, if I'm doing that well, and it's just like me writing my boss, at some point I realize, actually, I don't need to service this. My boss was called Devesh. I now know the right thing to do. So the process of writing the mail, if you have a good email culture, is actually an important part of the job. And when people, okay, so there might be sales emails or various things like that, fine, fair enough. But if it's a within organization email and people are doing that, it's just indicative of an appalling email culture. Now, this university has an appalling email culture. You know, one of my colleagues, I won't say which department, was, you know, at that time dealing with an email from one of his, you know, reports, but he'd be an academic in the department. We just all know what the form of that, some rambling rant from the academic that is not imagining, you know, doesn't actually help the circumstance at all, doesn't put themselves in his position as a head of department. That's just poor culture. And, you know, actually in that case, it might help to ask ChatGPT, should I send this email? Because it would probably say, no, don't be an idiot. But of course, the person's just venting, right? And so as all heads of department understand they have to deal with these venting emails. But so the point being there with the email example, even in that example where it seems it's this tedious thing, that there's actually, if you're doing email correctly, or correctly, I don't want to say correctly, if there's a good email culture, there's part of a learning process there. And then of course we can say the same thing with the writing of the essays, right? So I wrote this book. I didn't touch generative AI. I did not touch this book while I was writing, and a large part of that was because I was really worried about losing my voice to generative AI, right? Not that I'm against using tools. I was trying to find my voice as a writer. And since then, I absolutely use generative AI for a lot of things. I'll give generative AI, I'll do something. Jess writes incredible briefings for events, but sometimes she's not available. And I'll give generative AI a large amount of material and say, could you write me a briefing for this event? So I know I'm on top of my talking points. And it does an amazing job, right? It is actually really good at surfacing the things I should bring up and keeping me structured. If I did the op-ed I did for the Financial Times, I did not write it with generative AI, but I explored the subject before with generative AI and explored some of my ideas in conversations with generative AI before I started writing, and then I put pen to paper with my voice in the way I wanted it to. But then I also followed a trick that a colleague that writes for the Financial Times said, that once they tried, is I did just give it to generative AI, say, are there any typos or corrections in this? But please don't make the correction. Tell me what the correction is. So I got it to do a bit of copy editing, but I chose whether to make the changes or not. So there's a bunch of interesting ways that are in there that you can use it. And another thing, by the way, I do with it to explore subjects, coming back to the physics thing, I often have a conversation about an area of science that I don't know about, but I'm worried it's doing what it's doing to those physics students. So what I'll try and do is, after exploring this area and exploring my intuitions, but it could be just amplifying my misunderstandings like we're hearing for the students, what I then do is I'll say to it, okay, now write me a question sheet. Set me an exercise sheet. Imagine that we're setting an exercise sheet for a graduate physics student that is going to help them understand this area, and I force it to set questions that force me to go away and work through to prove to myself whether this is true. And of course, the challenge there is it's a very pleasant thing. It's about an issue of about like 10 minutes with a conversation with the thing to get into the sort of explore the idea and then think about it on a walk and then another conversation. The actual work to sit down and work out whether this is right or not takes hours. But it is an amazing thing to put yourself in the position where you're accessing such broad and potentially incorrect knowledge very quickly and testing ideas. But you just have to get to your point with it where you're going to try and make it real. And the weirdest thing about that is I just feel increasingly with this technology, it's switching the roles, right? Instead of normally, like the computer is saying, what you're saying doesn't compute, syntax error, I'm having to do that to the machine. So I'm getting it to send me a load of stuff, and I'm having to do all the validation that traditionally we would expect the machine is doing. And why is that? Because all we've done is produced a distilled essence of a vast swathe of humanity. And we haven't managed to bake in the piece that we expect to be in there, which is the bit Diane talked about at the beginning, that sort of Vulcan or data logic. And oddly, we're being forced to be more Vulcan and data and logical about addressing what it's giving us, which is quite weird.
On that note of paradox, let's have another show of hands. Who is now optimistic about our future with generative AI? It's actually more than before.
By three.
By three. A little bit. So a lot more in the book, but please join us now for a drink next door, and please join me in thanking Neil.
And thanking Diane.